The people of Israel had spent 400 years in the land of Egypt. And finally, as they cried out, God heard their cries. He sent Moses to deliver them out of Egypt. And you remember that God sent all the plagues upon Egypt. And finally, Pharaoh let the people go, and God opened up the Red Sea. The people went across, and then the sea closed up, swallowing Pharaoh's army. And then as they journeyed toward the promised land, the land that God had promised to give to the people, we see miracles of God bringing water from a rock, manna from heaven, and other miracles as well. And now the people had come to the edge of the promised land, the land that God was going to give them, a land flowing with milk and with honey. That's where we pick up in the book of Numbers, chapter 13. Verse 1, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Send out for yourselves men so that they may spy out the land of Canaan, which I am going to give to the sons of Israel. You shall send a man from each of the fathers' tribes, every one a leader among them. So Moses was to send out spies into the land of Egypt, or not of Egypt, but into the promised land. And here are the instructions that the spies were given. They were to look for what kind of people lived in the land and how many. They were to look to see whether the land was good or bad, whether the cities were fortified, what the produce was like. So they sent out 12 spies into the land, the promised land. And they spent 40 days in the promised land. Now let's look down at verse 27. It says, as the spies came back, this is the report. Thus they told him, the spies told Moses, We went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, just like God said. And this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large, and moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. So the people went into this promised land. And they came back and they said, God, it's everything God said it was going to be, but there's giants in the land. The cities are fortified. Oh, it's good stuff. In fact, they came back, they brought a sample of food from the promised land. It was a vine of grapes that was so large it had to be carried on a pole between two men. It was everything that God said it was going to be. But the 10 of the spies had the attitude, we can't go in because it's not going to be easy. I mean, after all, if God promises us something and we get ready to go do that, it's supposed to be easy, isn't it? I mean, after all, God said we did, so it just ought to be easy. At least that's the attitude we have. God was supposed to make things easy for the people just to march right in. To move in, sit on their comfortable couches, and have just a great life. Isn't it amazing how sometimes we think that just because we are people of God, that God is somehow duty-bound to make life so easy for us? Well, as we move on down to verse 30, continuing the story, we find that even though 10 of the spies had a bad report, at least one had a good report. Verse 30, Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, We should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it. That was not the end. Thank God one person had a different viewpoint. Caleb stood all alone. I mean, look at his statement. What a great statement of faith. He says, we should by all means go up. We should go up and take possession of this land because we will surely overcome it. I mean, this was complete and total and absolute confidence that Caleb possessed. There was no doubt whatsoever in the mind of Caleb. There was no, well, you know, if everything comes together, if we get lucky here or there, if things go just right, then we can go in and take the land. No, Caleb had an attitude of victory, and that victory came from total trust in God. Now let's look at verse 31. But The men who had gone up with Caleb said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us." So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone and spying it out, a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. There also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, so we were in their sight." I want you to think again about the instructions that the spies were given when they went into the promised land. They were to do 4 things. They were to determine what kind of people were in the land and how many. Second of all, they were to decide whether the land was good or bad. Third, decide if the cities are fortified. And fourth, to see what the produce was like. I want you to notice that nowhere in those instructions does it say that the spies were to make the decision whether or not to enter the promised land. That decision had already been taken care of. The people had already received a great promise from God, a possession of the land, and they were given their marching orders to go into their land. Their part was to obey, not to decide whether or not to go in. Listen, you need to understand that when God gives you marching orders, when God gives you direction in your life, He's not asking for your opinion. He's not opening things up for discussion. It doesn't matter what you think. You have your marching orders. You see, the other 10 spies responded by saying, "Boy, the people are just too big for it. There are giants in the land." And you know what? They were right. The people were too strong for them, but they were not too strong for God. You see, these people had already forgotten the awesome power of God. They had already forgot about the plagues. They had already forgot about the Red Sea opening up. They had forgot about the water coming from the rock. They had forgot about the manna from heaven. The problem is they focused on their circumstances instead of focusing on God. You know, when we come up against a tough situation, our first response is to come up with all the reasons as to why it cannot be done. And we do not look to God. Look down in chapter 14, verse 1. Let's see the response of the people. "Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, 'Would that we have died in the land of Egypt, or would that we have died in this wilderness. And why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?' So they said to one another, 'Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt.'" The people began to blame God. The people stood at a great crossroads in their life. They stood on the edge of the land that God had promised to give them. Abundant blessings lay in front of them. And the people had 2 choices. They could move in faith and courage, or they could go back. They chose to go back. You know, we face that same situation many times in our life. We can either move ahead and trust in the power of God, or we can turn and run. We have to realize that there are consequences to the decision we make. You see, because the people rebelled and decided to go back, they spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and that generation did not see the promised land. Going against the will of God will never lead to the blessings of God. You know, there's some great lessons in this passage, and I wish I had more time to spend on it. But you know, the majority may not always be right. Caleb listened to the voice of God rather than the voice of the people. Caleb had faith. Faith is belief in the unseen. Faith is believing in the promises of God even though you may not be able to see the end result. Real faith looks beyond what you can see. You see, Caleb saw the very same thing the other spies saw. However, Caleb looked beyond the present reality to the supernatural power of God. Very simply, obedience leads to blessing. Disobedience leads to judgment. Some of you are standing at crossroads in your life today. You're standing on the edge of the promised land. Some of you actually prayed and you believed that God was leading you to come to LeTourneau University. But you found out there were giants in the land. Some of you took a step of faith, felt that God was leading you to a new career in life. But you found out there were giants in the land. Some of you felt that God was leading you to make a major decision in your life. And you began to step out, but you found out there were giants in the land. And you wanted to go back. Some of you are trying to go back to Egypt today instead of following the voice of God. God's promises are true. Listen, if God led you to a decision, God will fulfill that promise. It may not be easy. There may be giants in the land, but guess what? By the power of God, you can conquer those giants. Some of you need to take a step of faith today. You need to move forward. You need to quit looking back. You need to quit longing for the old days, and you need to step in faith to the land that God has promised you. You can overcome the giants in your life by the power of God.